Bigs in Blue is a program that the Chattanooga Police Department is founding with big brothers and big sisters. I mentioned moments ago that it was with Girls Inc., and that was a mistake. But big brothers and big sisters are partnering, as we are reading in a press release at Nooga.com, with a new initiative, which, by the way, is redundant, called Bigs in Blue, which aims to provide one-on-one mentoring opportunities for area students. Chief Roddy says being trusted by our community is built one relationship at a time. Bigs in Blue is a meaningful way for CPD officers to be part of a child's life, providing guidance, friendship, and building relationships that positively affect the life of that child, our community, and our officers. At the same time as the police chief, David Roddy, is trying to build relationships at the lower end of the community, maybe the wealthier end, perhaps, he is petitioning to have a new authority that will create a whole criminal area of government, an area that government calls criminal, and which the city corporation, through his department, will enforce, right? Enforcing an ordinance against a large group of people. Most of them are not really young. They're probably all past 20, probably with a few exceptions. We're told that there are 4,000 potential homeless people per year in Chattanooga by one TV report recently by Tim Fan. 4,000 people a year at some point in the year are homeless in Chattanooga, and many of them end up asking for alms. Alms are, of course, favors and gifts from those who have to one who holds himself forth as not having and in need. A man who is a beggar, a woman who is a beggar, is asking for alms. Also, holding forth the pan, right? The pan is where the gift coins go, or the dollar bills, the $5 bills are dropped into the pan. So those persons are panhandlers. They're handling the pan, extending it to you, the listener, asking for money. Now we have with us an expert, John Rector, an expert on the homelessness question, and he's an expert because he has nearly 2 decades of experience dealing with homeless people in Chattanooga. John Rector is the director of Union Gospel Mission there here in Chattanooga, in the shadows, if you will, of Signal Mountain. And Chief Roddy, John, points out to City Council Tuesday, a week ago, that many times giving a homeless man who's extending the pan, giving money to him really doesn't help him at all. It just feeds a wicked habit. That is a point that Chief Roddy makes for my listeners' consideration. How do you respond to that, and where can we go with this discussion?
Well, first of all, I think Chief Roddy is right in that assertion. Just from experience, and sometimes you have to speak in blanket statements. So as a blanket statement, most of the time, those folks who are panhandling, who are asking for money, sometimes demanding it, the vast majority of those folks are going to spend whatever you give them on unnecessary and unhelpful things for them. Drugs, alcohol, things of that nature. Very rarely would in my opinion, is that going to go towards helpful things: food, rent, clothing, gas money. Savings. That's just out of experience. Anybody that wants to eat in Chattanooga can eat
without begging.
The Chattanooga Community Kitchen serves 3 meals a day. The Rescue Mission serves an evening meal every evening. There's all kinds of places that serve meals where you can eat if you're hungry. And so especially when you're talking about the downtown area, for someone to say, well, I need to beg so I can eat, that's not necessarily true.
And when the man says, can you give me $5 so I can have something to eat, that half of that sentence is in the direction of a prevarication or a lie. You're suggesting, John Rector.
Most of the time, yeah. I would say that is probably the majority of the truth.
Well, that seems to support Chief Roddy's argument that we need to have an expansion of the area of where a ban applies. So right now, if you are a listener just joining us, there's a prohibition in the ordinance that disallows and forbids panhandling in touristy parts of Chattanooga. That would be the IMAX Theater, the block in which the aquarium is found, Miller Park, Miller Plaza, and a couple of others that are kind of high tourist zones. So we are protecting strangers and visitors to Chattanooga from having to deal with our local mendicants but we're not protecting other people like you. Let's say you are on Access Road in Brainerd, just about to go up on Northmore Road, and there you'll find sometimes a man or a woman begging for money, or at North Point Boulevard here in Hickson, you'll find someone there asking for money for food or necessaries. Right now, those people are not under the ban, and the chief proposes to make that the ban that applies to the tourist areas cover the entire city, to give his officers, there are about 500 of them sworn, John Rector, authority to arrest, threaten, bully, seize, and take before the magistrate.
Yeah, when you first mentioned this to me, I'm torn on the issue. I see, first of all, if there's going to be a law, an ordinance, a mandate against panhandling, it either needs to be citywide or don't do it. I'm not a fan of selective enforcement.
Is that because people who are the subject of the enforcement don't know when they are subject to it or when they're not, meaning that it's unconstitutionally vague? Is that what you were suggesting?
No, I think that's probably true, but that from a personal issue, I think if you're going to protect if you're paid to protect and serve the city of Chattanooga, you ought to protect and serve the whole city. When you only protect and serve the downtown tourist districts, to me, that's I don't know if there's a legal term, but that's kind of wrongful prosecution. Do the whole thing or leave it alone. That's the take I was coming from.
Well, what else can you say about the abuse of the donations that beggars commit? I mean, they receive money. You suggest that they are not going to use it properly. Most of the time, Chief Roddy holds to that view. What should be done by the city council, John Rector?
Well, when I first started doing the work I do, working with the homeless and working with missions here locally, I was somewhat aghast to find out by some of our clients that in panhandling, they made more a week than I did. And so it's not like all of these folks are doing this just, their subsistence living. They actually make a decent living doing this. And so, like I said, I'm torn, because on one hand, it's not good for them. It's not good for the city. Those monies that they are earning are not being taxed. They're not going into helping pay for the roads they beg at or panhandle at. And so on that sense, I understand the need to do something. For me personally, on the other hand, I'm a big fan of personal liberties. And I think the fewer laws we have, the better off we are overall as a people.
Well, what should my listener do, John? Would you say the listener who resides in their corporation should call his council member and say what should, because the council is going to say no to Chief Roddy or to say yes. And so how would you advise my listener on this point?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have great advice. My advice is this. You study the situation, make an informed decision, and then you make your voice heard. That's what's great about our type of government.
Well, John, system. You're copping out on me. I want an answer from you.
If I good enough. To nail down, if I had to choose one way or the other, I think we should not have panhandling. And if it takes a city ordinance to do that, then I think that's probably the best way to go.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, and I know I put you on the spot there. And there's a bead of sweat gathering on your eyebrow, John Rector of Union Gospel Mission. But think about this though, John. You have these officers. They are military men. Okay, they're military men and women. They have armor plate. They're wearing a war uniform. They have military insignia with ranks and so on. They have pistols. They have tasers. They have cuffs, and they all nowadays have on the front of their belts 3 clips, probably 9mm clips with 16 rounds apiece. 16 plus 1. They can fire 17 times. That's nearly 50 shots. So they have these Navy frigate beaks on the front of their persons, cutting the wind, as it were, as they move toward their victim or the person they're trying to help. And so we're putting into their care people who are victims. They are of themselves. They're victims of their own sins. They're victims of their own vices, their own unwillingness to make commitments, to mend old wounds that they have with family members who might be able to help them or hire them. These are people who are often just abandoned to their own folly as poor and homeless. And you have at Union Gospel Mission, where you've been working in some form or other for 18 years, you have 11 guys. So here we have the officer, and he has no arrest powers in most of the city to deal with someone who's begging. He just has no power. And so if he's there, even with his uniform, he's there as a private person, and he has to deal with that person privately and personally, maybe offering him some money, maybe offering to take him over to the nearest Burger King for a Whopper and fries and a Coke. for $6, and things like that. But now you're saying, well, we want to have the ordinance expanded to cover the whole city, and now this officer will always encounter a homeless person in his uniform, of course, in an aggressive military fashion, and that person is now always a subject and a suspect in something.
Well, the key word of what you use is perceived. And I say, whether there's an ordinance or not, that officer is already perceived as the authority. And if he approaches that person panhandling and says, you can't do this here, you need to move on, most of the time the person panhandling is going to move on based on the perceived authority of that officer. Now, where the problem comes in, David, is not so much in, is there a law, is there not a law, is there an ordinance, is there not an ordinance? I think the problem is in training our police officers. I think our police officers are not always trained, or sometimes even screened as well as they should be.
What is the result of that?
The result of it is terrible one-on-one interactions. I've got a daughter.
Explain.
Well, I've got a daughter who's now 23. Since she's been driving at 16, she has had numerous encounters with the local police. Sometimes they were due to her speeding or not behaving in a way that she should. Never really anything that you would term, terribly illegal, but speeding or getting in an accident. But sometimes she'd been down in the lesser part of town near the projects. She would be there to help somebody. She grew up with me in the mission, learning that, understanding that, Abby. And so there's been a number of times she's been pulled over in that part of town for, driving while white. It's profiling. You're in that part of town. You don't really have any business down there at 10 o'clock at night. And her interactions with police have always been terrible. She has a strong dislike of the police because they automatically assume guilt when you're somewhere they don't think you should be.
They assume she's dealing in drugs or whoring.
Yeah, or selling or buying or doing something illegal instead of just stopping to say, hey, are you okay? Is everything okay here? There's also always the assumption of wrongdoing.
And so if we have, John Rector, the expansion of this ordinance to cover all of Chattanooga, the officer will always view the individual as a subject and suspect. And if that person has, especially if the officer sees it himself, that the person is waving at someone or trying to speak to someone who's maybe just out of hearing, and so he raises his voice, the officer not too close can hear the raising voice, but not hear what is said. And he walks toward the subject and the member of the public and encounters him. We have effectively a criminal act in process under the ordinance, and that's the concern of my listeners, that we are criminalizing activities in which no one is injured. No one is injured by a beggar. The beggar knows what assault is. He's not going to assault someone. Even an aggressive panhandler who's violating the Title 39 statute, which forbids aggressive panhandling at the state level, that clearly those are really acts of assault if you look at the statute. And most panhandlers are not going to do that. They may say twice, "Can you give me some money?" If you say no, they may say it again. That violates the state law. And they may block you a little bit by coming towards you, try to catch you as you try to go around them. That also could be a violation of the statute. We have a criminal act in progress, and that's the concern I have, is that we have, as the free market analysis would hold, a criminalization of poverty, a criminalization of an inevitable human activity that is older than the oldest profession.
Well, I guess the question there is it an inevitable activity? Is it not just an activity of choice? You could say that, drug use is a victimless crime, but it's still illegal. And so I think the precedent has somewhat been set. And again, I'm a big fan of personal liberty, but at the same time, I know we have to have order in our cities, in our lives. And so while I still am personally torn, if I have to choose, I still think the ordinance is probably the best, or the lesser of two evils.
Make sure you can read more about this at yournews.com. That's yournews.com. If you're in the Chattanooga area, just type that in and your URL will direct you to the Chattanooga page. If for some reason you end up on a page out of Atlanta or Seattle at yournews.com, just type in your location and your computer will remember to come to our website. That's our chief sponsor here on the David Tulis Show, yournews.com. And the question that I want you to consider there, if you have to bail out on us now because you have to get to work, check in later at yournews.com. The question there is not Chief Roddy seeking to raise the level of coercion and threat in the city? And I'm quantifying that. I'm quantifying coercion and threat as an evil thing. I'm quantifying it as something that is wrong and should not, and is beneath us. It is beneath us to have military people with military training, military bearing, leading their defendants into court, right? Leading their subjects into court, to judgment, to jail. Do we need that, or are there alternatives that are not within the power of government, John Rector? Are there not alternatives to the panhandling problem, as it's described in the press, that are not in the hands of government, but really in the hands of others who are not subject to government? What are alternative remedies for panhandling? What can be done by the church? What can be done by ministries? By my listener? What can my listener do? Perhaps, John Rector, to discourage someone who's panhandling from doing that and doing something better?
Well, I think when you look at the reason for panhandling and you say, okay, this person is panhandling because there is a true need. Their family is needy. They're trying to raise rent money. In those situations, yeah, there's things we can do. There's programs we can put in place. The church can get involved. The nonprofit organizations can get involved. The missions can get involved. But that's simply not the case. Most, again, not all of them, but most of those folks who are panhandling are doing that to get money or resources to then do something illegal. And so I think you have to unfortunately paint with a broad brush in this situation.
So in your analysis, John Rector, of Union Gospel Mission, I'm being too charitable in my assessment of the people, even though we both admit that they're prone to vices, they're prone to self-destructive actions. Many of them have mental problems, or maybe would you say that those who are panhandlers really are the ones who don't have mental problems because they've smartened up and figured out how to get my listener the mark?
I think it's a mix of both. I think there's both the mental health issue as well as just good old fashioned criminal intent. You give me $5, I can go buy some crack or some marijuana or whatever it is, and go that direction. What you have to remember is maybe, and I don't know what the statistics are, but maybe when you crack down on panhandling, your crimes of theft go up because now they have no resource to panhandle. I don't know what the long-term situation would be there.
Well, the homeless population generally has a disproportionate level of encounters with police, especially men who are poor and homeless. They have very high levels of cop encounters, probably equal to your average black young man in his 20s who on average would have between 10, 15, 20, 30 encounters with cops in the course of his young life. Anthony Byrd, the city council member, when I asked him how many times he'd been stopped by police he's in his 40s, he said 20, 30, 40 times, too many to count was his answer. And that is because he's in a suspect class. And police are, John, they're by design, they're a social management tool of elites against lower classes. The lower classes would be, and I know the Marxists have picked up on this analysis, but it is one. Chris Hedges, for example, has made this analysis. The Presbyterian minister and writer. There's a Marxian element to it, but it is true. I think that policing serves to manage and control and to keep cowed subject populations. That would be young black men. That would be labor. That would be dissenters, protesters. These are all people who are subject to, real-time enforcement, real-time training, real-time center data management, and then officer management practices. And I'd like to think that Chattanooga is better than that. That we don't have to stoop to that kind of abuse of law against classes of people. John.
Well, I understand exactly where you're coming from, and I think there's some truth in it. What I also would say we need to think about is this. Let's go back 200 years to the crime problem that existed 200 years ago. When somebody did something stupid, for lack of a better term, there was immediate and swift, justice, for lack of a better word. When men, the old saying is an armed society is a polite society. Nowadays, when a kid in school does something stupid, there's no recourse. he gets away with just being stupid. And all kids are stupid, don't get me wrong. But, even 50 years ago, you did something stupid, you were liable to get a beat down, right? Just by the people around you, or by your parents, or by your grandparents, or somebody else in the neighborhood. They were going to whip your tail. We have taken all consequences away from poor decisions.
And we've also professionalized this sort of social management. There used to not be police officers. The first 100 years of the Republic had no police departments at all. And Chattanooga was founded to catch runaway slaves prior to the great conflagration of so-called the Civil War. And all around the South, Southern police departments were founded to harass slaves, harass blacks who didn't have the proper permits to travel about, or who had escaped their masters and were seeking refuge at points north. They were designed to catch the runaway slave. And so I think black people have a long-time resentment against blacks, and blacks, African Americans, generally fear and dread the officer, even though in meeting them at a public event, at say Big Brothers Big Sisters event, there's a lot of nice show and grace and smiles and how do you do's between the public and the officer. But they have a dark history. If you read any of the histories, Roger Roots has one. You, the listener, go to Nooganomics.com and just look up Roger Roots, ROOTS, Our Cops Constitutional. It's a history of policing. And there are, of course, many others. Radley Balco, looking most recently at the militarization of police. So that's my concern, John, is that the people you care for are now subjected to the hard, the handcuffs and the cell bar. That's what they're subjected to. And I just regret that there doesn't seem to be a strong movement against that, John Rector.
And I agree with you. I think. Again, I'm all for personal liberty. Unfortunately, personal liberty sometimes brings with it certain consequences. If you cannot learn to have your personal liberty and do it in the right way without harming others or hindering others, then that brings a problem.
Caller, you're live on the air with John Rector. David Tulis, what's on your mind? Well, go on, John. What else can you say? We have about a minute.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't like the idea that there has to be a panhandling law. I wish we could do without it. But if it serves the purpose of the greater good, and I know you got to be real careful with that phrase. But in doing that, it also helps those who are harming themselves in panhandling. Then I think some good could come out of it.
Well, this is David Tulis and John Rector of Union Gospel Mission. Thank you for joining us. How can my listener find out more about your work?
The best way to find out is the internet. Our website is www.theuniongospelmission.org. That's uniongospelmission.org.
Theuniongospelmission.org is the Union Gospel Mission. Find out more about that, and think of becoming one of the new contributors to this very fine Christian labor. Right now, there are 10 formerly homeless men there. They are in a Christian program. And John, thanks very much.
Glad to be here.
This is David Tulis. We are live at Nooga Radio, and we will be right back. I've got some important messages. We're going to hear about the breastfeeding traffic stop, a Tennessee breastfeeding traffic stop. And we'll hear about that here. You can, if you can't stay tuned to our wonderful station, here's my important announcements. Make sure you go to yournews.com today, yournews.com. And down at the bottom is the local news.
Chattanooga Morning News with Russ and Val. Weekdays from